Hi, everyone. Famous Zoom move. My name is Kellie McElhaney. Welcome to our Board Essentials webinar. As I said, I'm Kellie McElhaney. I'll get it down. I'm the founding faculty director of the Haas Center of Equity, Gender, and Leadership, and also on the faculty at the Haas School of Business. It's so great to see so many Haas alums, Haas executive MBA students out there, guests of Haas alums, men and women on this topic. We're really excited to welcome you here. And first and foremost, I hope everybody is safe and healthy. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce in a moment Shannon Gordon, the CEO of theBoardlist, who's going to then start. But before that, a few things. This event is brought to you by three of us, a new partnership, a new marriage. Well, actually, two of us are already married, Haas Alumni Relations and us, the Center for Equity, Gender, and Leadership at the Haas School of Business. But our new partner is Shannon and her organization at theBoardlist, and she'll tell you much more about that organization. But a couple of guidelines before I introduce Shannon. All participants are muted during the duration of the webinar. We will be taking questions using the Q&A feature down at the bottom. Please enter questions at any point during the webinar, and we will have time at the end for Q&A. We'll do our best to get through as many questions as possible. So before I turn it over and introduce Shannon, the Center for Equity, Gender, and Leadership at Haas launched at the end of 2017. We educate equity fluent leaders to ignite and accelerate change. And equity fluent leaders are what we are training at Haas and who we hope will be out there leading everywhere in the business world. And an equity fluent leader is somebody who absolutely understands the power of diversity and inclusion and the business value that gives to companies who really embrace. So we're going to be talking about the reasons why we need diverse and inclusive boards, and we'll be talking about that more today. And I'm going to just, something I was reading this week, if you don't subscribe to the Broadsheet by Fortune, B-R-O-A-D sheet, it's a fantastic daily news aggregator. So I was excited on Monday, right? I read it. Fortune 500 list, the highest number of females, 37, woo, out of 500. We're supposed to cheer, but we have to look at good news right now. We're at an all-time high, 7.4% female CEOs in the Fortune 500. I want to note, as I always do, that they are on that list of 37 female CEOs as of Monday. 3 of those women are of color. 1 is Southeast Asian, Sonia Singhal of Gap Inc., and 2 are Asian. We have 0 Black and 0 Latina female CEOs. But what's so interesting is we got this rah-rah note on Monday. By yesterday, it had dropped to 36. So the percentages, it's difficult when you're talking about that few numbers, but we do know that there is a linkage between diverse boards and having more diverse women as CEOs and leaders. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our host for today, Shannon Gordon. She's the CEO of Boardlist. She's a technology executive and has decades of experience building and scaling new customer experiences. She's currently the CEO of Boardlist, our new partner, a curated talent marketplace that connects highly qualified female leaders with board opportunities at public and private companies. Before theBoardlist, she was the SVP of Operations and Customer Experience at Ship and VP of Customer Experience at Walmart.com. She's also worked at McKinsey & Company, and though she has her MBA from TikTok, we're going to claim her because we're here with you today. So Shannon, over to you.
Thanks. I guess we could have left that last part off.
That was nice to say.
Today I'll be a part of Haas.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kellie. I'm so thrilled to be with this audience today and to be a partner of Haas. I think extremely highly of the work that the center has done, and of course delighted to be working with the Alumni Association to bring some content to all of you today. Normally, of course, we do these things in person, and that has gotten a little bit sidelined in the last couple of months, but we've adapted and we are now virtual. So thank you all for joining. What I wanted to do today was walk you through a couple of slides that I put together just to orient you a little bit to what's happening in the world of boards, what changes are afoot, what the implications are for you as potential candidates. And then I really thought we would just open it up to questions. I know Kelly and I have talked about, some topics that we definitely want to cover, but certainly as I'm going through the slides and questions come up, feel free to populate the Q&A, and we'll cover absolutely as many as we can, but hopefully that the content is mostly driven by you. So let me, give me just a moment here to share my screen for these couple of slides. Great. So I thought I would start with the transforming boardroom, because I do truly believe that it is in the middle of a transformation, albeit I would say at the beginning of one. We have a lot of work left to do. And it's really not just on the diversity front, but I'll focus primarily on that for now. So, one of the issues that we have with boards is that, they are, like many other parts of leadership, wildly undiverse at the moment. Moving in the right direction, but still largely quite homogeneous. And part of this, of course, I'm sure there are some bad apples out there or malintent or whatever, but I think for the most part, what's happening is that boards in particular are very dependent on referrals and networks. Right, so our estimates, and I've seen this number anywhere between 85 and 95%. In any case, it is very dependent on referrals. So typically board directors, when they're looking for a new board member, will request recommendations from their colleagues, other board directors, other CEOs. And unfortunately, what we know about that group is that it is mostly men. And I don't at all mean to say that men don't know great women and support great women. There are plenty of those on the board list that are doing a lot to advocate for their female colleagues. But in general, our networks, just by definition, tend to be pretty homogeneous. And so what is an incredible pipeline of diverse talent actually doesn't get tapped into that much. In fact, the average number of boards, we have a number of board directors on our platform, and the average number of boards that they're serving on is between 3 and 4. So, boards are tapping into a pretty common pool of talent, and those individuals are serving on a number of different boards. So the net result is that we don't have as much diversity as we'd like to see. The 18% that you see there is a blended number of private and public companies. S&P 500 is in the 25% range, whereas private companies are as low as 7%. So we have quite a bit of disparity as well, just depending on what types of companies you're looking at. But things are changing, so I wanted to give a little backdrop. I'm not going to walk through each of these elements on the timeline here, but suffice it to say that there is quite a bit of advocacy going on, not just from within companies, but we're starting to see governments get involved, institutional investors, which obviously have a tremendous amount of influence on the makeup of boards within the companies they're invested in. So State Street Advisors, BlackRock, and others have all made statements about their expectations for the level of diversity on the boards of their portfolio companies. And then California came out swinging in 2018. Senator Hannah Beth Jackson in Southern California authored a bill that was passed requiring that every publicly traded company in the state of California have at least one woman on its board by the end of 2019. And then those thresholds ratchet up depending on the size of the board for subsequent years. We saw an incredible shift, which I'll mention here on the next slide, but several states then followed suit. We recently had Goldman Sachs say that they wouldn't take companies public if they didn't have a woman on the board. The broader focus is diverse candidates, but initially focused primarily on women. So really interesting context shift. And I just wanted to mention that here because opportunities, I am very much of the belief that this incredible pipeline has existed for a very long time of qualified board-ready diverse candidates. But more and more opportunities for connection with these companies that are building out exceptional boards are opening up as a result of some of this legislation, but then I just think broader awareness of the issue. So just quickly on the impact, it's pretty astounding to me. In 2018, we had about, I think it was 180 companies that were compliant with the legislation that passed in California, meaning they had at least one woman on their board. And we had almost as many women join those boards in 2019 alone. So in 2018, obviously that's the buildup of many, many years of building out boards. So, you know, it certainly had an impact, as quotas often do. So there's been some interesting change happening, particularly in California. But I also wanted to broaden this. I know, you know, I'm sure we have a lot of men on the call, and I oftentimes get the question, well, is it just gender diversity that we're seeing? And the answer is no. I think there's been a really interesting change that's been happening within boardrooms as boards get more and more kind of sophisticated about thinking through the composition of their board and ensuring that it matches the strategic imperatives for the company going forward. So rather than thinking about compiling a group of, I put in quotes, board experienced CEOs, because that's so often the criteria that boards are looking for. You know, we want somebody who's already served on a board, and we want somebody who's a sitting CEO or maybe CFO to serve. That definition is just broadened so much. So of all the new board directors that joined the S&P 500 companies came from outside top executive ranks, those being CFO and CEO. And then 27% of the directors that joined S&P 500 boards were serving on their very first corporate or for-profit board, which is really interesting because, again, this board experience kind of chicken and egg problem of it, well, if I don't have board experience, how do I go get it, is falling by the wayside. And I think a big part of that is that, you know, more and more skill sets around emerging technologies, specialization in particular customer segments that have increasing purchasing power, like women, like millennials, right? Those are all helping us skew younger into different functional areas of expertise, all of which tend to be more diverse areas. So that's been a really interesting trend as well that is not specifically focused on diversity, but actually has opened the doors quite a bit to candidates that might not have had as many opportunities in the past. So that's my brief overview of the landscape. There's a lot more we could talk about there, but I know everyone's kind of wondering, how do we get on that first board? So let me address that for a moment here. So I always start with a few things that you will need, and number one is patience. You know, as you might have experience from your operating careers, you know, open roles can be open from anywhere between a month to 3-4 months maybe, and occasionally longer if you're really looking for a unicorn candidate. But board roles take quite a long time. They can happen in, you know, as short as 3 months or so, but we often see them taking quite a bit longer. And you might ask, why is that? Part of it is because the chemistry amongst the board is so critical. These are not kind of typical reporting relationships. And so, you know, it truly is a team. And really getting to know the board directors and the management team is an important part of the interview process. So often that's what takes precedence, to say nothing of the fact that board tends to have a little bit less urgency than an operating role, right? If you don't have a CFO in place, you sure as heck are going to go out there and find one really quick. But, you know, a board director oftentimes, not always, doesn't hold the same urgency. And so that's part of what drives the timeline as well. A strong network. So, you know, there are increasingly, you know, tools out there that help people get connected to board opportunities, but by and large, this is still a very networked process. And so, you know, as I mentioned on a prior slide, so many of these searches happen between, you know, colleagues asking colleagues for recommendations. So I always say, you know, and particularly we find with the female candidates that we work with, there is a tendency sometimes to think that the great work you are doing as an operator in your day job is going to get noticed and you will just start to get calls about boards. And sometimes certainly that does happen. But we always recommend that you make your ambitions to join a board known to your network. It's really hard for people to help you if they don't know what you want and what you're looking for. So literally articulating, here's what I think I bring to the table. Here's what I think I can add. These are the types of companies I'd like to join. Can you introduce me to X? Is a very important conversation to have with those in your network that are well positioned to help you. And the last is kind of a superpower, which is maybe a silly word, but as I've said, you don't have to be a CEO or CFO, But inevitably, with ideally a world of opportunity to find great talent for boards, those that end up in the seat typically have something really valuable to add to that company. And that varies company to company. We'll talk a little bit about the skill sets that companies are particularly interested in. But it is, important, obviously, that you've had a career that sort of positions you as someone who has got expertise in an area that is of relevance to the board that you're speaking with. So again, we'll talk a little bit about how to start articulating this and get your hands around what that superpower might be, but it is definitely an ingredient in the process. I also like to just cover off on understanding the role. This is by no means comprehensive, and I'm sure any lawyers in the audience might say, oh, I would articulate this differently, so do not hold me to this. But in general, some of the roles that a board will play is, certainly hiring and firing the CEO, being a strategic advisor to management, thinking long-term about risk planning and mitigation. This one is becoming increasingly obvious where boards are not doing this well, but it is a core responsibility of the board to think about areas of risk of the business and putting mitigation plans in place to ensure that those risks are minimized. The integrity of financial statements, this is a significant role of an audit committee, representing interests of shareholders, and then executive compensation as example areas of focus for a board. But I list them primarily to contrast to what a board does not do, which is determine strategy, manage the execution of that strategy, kind of set tone and culture, and be the visible leaders of a company. For the employee base, I mean, not externally. The reason I want to call that out is because, and I'll mention this again a little bit later, oftentimes this transition between being an operator and being a board director can be a little bit difficult for new candidates that haven't served on a board before. And really understanding the differences between the role as a board director, you're asking a lot of questions, you're offering advice, you're making connections in the day job in a non-crisis time. Generally, that's the role that you're playing. And so coming in as kind of a hard-hitting executive of, I do this and I do that, and I, know how to execute and drive to results isn't necessarily what people are looking for in a board director. And so keeping that in mind as you enter into an interview process is really important for how you kind of portray the value that you would add to being a part of the board. So important to understand the role. Certainly you can leverage your network to get more information about the kinds of responsibilities that a board has. So defining your value proposition, this is another one of those big hurdles for a first-time candidate, is really thinking about what is it that you bring to the table specifically. So the ideal situation, I always say, is where you take your area of expertise and marry it with what you're passionate about. And then that has to overlap with expertise that the company needs. So, it won't do a whole lot of good if you've got a very niche, area of expertise and, there are no other companies that are working on or facing that problem. It's sort of an unlikely scenario. But what you really want to do is think about the boards that you're interested in serving on because you're passionate about their product or because you feel like you have something very valuable to add to that boardroom. And really think about how your expertise marries up with some of the topics you imagine they would be talking about in the boardroom. These things, it sounds a little mysterious, what gets discussed in a boardroom. But if we really sit back and think about it and you imagine some of the companies that you're particularly interested in likely know something about, you could kind of forecast the types of topics that might be coming up in that boardroom. And if you've got expertise that matches up to that, I think that's a great place to start when you think about your value proposition. But regardless of what exactly it is really important to be thoughtful about how you'll articulate that before launching into some of these conversations. There are a lot of CMOs out there, for example. There are a lot of lawyers out there, for example. So what is it that makes you unique? And why should that board be really considering you as the primary candidate for the role that they have open? So we can certainly dive into more of that as we get into questions. Skills in demand, I will just preemptively address this because I always get this question, what are people looking for? I have listed some, but certainly please do not think that this is an exhaustive list. It is almost as long as the number of companies that that come to us looking for directors. They're very unique in their needs, and so you never know where you'd be a good fit. But by and large, you know, the primary thing that we find people are looking for is experience with growth and scaling, and that's quite nebulous, obviously. But it comes in the flavor usually of, we really want someone with P&L management who has grown a company from X to Y, and the X to Y is obviously specific to that company, and different candidates are going to be appropriate for that opportunity. But in general, sort of shepherding a company through growth is an attractive skill set. The reverse is also true, by the way. Downsizing, and certainly, you know, in the environment that we're in, I think, you know, experience in restructuring and downsizing is less frequently, but also a skill set that is in demand. Emerging technologies, as I said, cybersecurity, AI, IoT, these areas are increasingly relevant beyond just the tech industry. And so companies that might not be mired in that day-to-day are oftentimes looking for expertise to bring onto their board to support. Transaction experience, but if you've ever been through an IPO or M&A, that would certainly be something you would want to be talking about in your board interviews. Talent and culture leveraged as a strategic asset is certainly a new-ish area of importance. There's quite a bit of debate about the role of kind of HR people leaders in the boardroom, and many companies are moving towards being sure to add somebody who is thinking specifically about talent and culture. Because of the competitive environment that we're in for recruiting, some of the issues, frankly, that have been front page failures of boards to adequately see risk around culture in particular. So those are a few things that have driven that to be front and center for many boards. I mentioned before the customer segments, and then digital transformation. You know, I at least today, I'm sitting here in Silicon Valley in San Francisco. We're always thinking about this, but there are a lot of industries that are still kind of going through a digital transformation or experiencing some kind of technology disruption. And so folks with that background tend to be really valuable for companies that are maybe even well outside of their industry area of expertise, but because they have experience in digital transformation, can be very valuable assets to a board. So I'll wrap here just by sharing a little bit about the board list. So Kelly mentioned that we are partnered with Haas, and I feel I would do a disservice to the partnership if I didn't just share with you a little bit about what we do. So the board list is an online platform that connects exceptional women with global board opportunities. It's a very simple proposition. Take this phenomenal pipeline of diverse talent and connect them with board opportunities that come to us. So my numbers there are a little small on the screen, I apologize, but about a quarter of the companies that we work with are public companies, and the remainder are private. And those range between, you know, early stage to late stage companies. And the reason I wanted to mention that is because, you know, I think oftentimes for first-time directors, it can be really daunting. Again, this chicken and egg problem of, if public companies are looking for board experience directors, how do I get the board experience to become a potential candidate for one of those companies? A great way to do that is to think about private company boards. Sometimes that criteria is there as well for private boards, but oftentimes, you know, they're looking for a specific skill set and are willing to overlook the fact that maybe you haven't served on a board before. So it's a nice place to start, and it's a large percentage of the companies that do come to the board list. We are thrilled that almost half of the placements that the board list has been involved in have been women serving on their very first for-profit board, which is really exciting because, again, part of our mission is making sure that we're infusing talent into the boardroom that might not have gotten that exposure before. So that's something we're really proud of. So there are a couple ways that you can engage with us. Become a candidate. It's free. And the great news for this group in particular is if you are a Haas alum, you have fast-track approval. So Haas can endorse you onto our platform, and then you're automatically a candidate. For others that are not part of Haas, we do require a recommendation from a for-profit board director. So that's a really nice benefit that Haas is providing you all. You also have the opportunity to recommend talent. So this is the way that we identify this pipeline, and it's a great way for you to elevate wonderful women in your network that should have access to board opportunities. So please, if you're a man or a woman, please come to the board list and let us know about great women that we should be connecting with board opportunities. And if you're looking to add a board director, certainly the board list is a great resource. So please definitely reach out to me or just go to theboardlist.com and get started there. So that's what I had prepared. I think I'll switch over and just see in our chat if we have any questions that have come up. Let me just stop sharing my screen here for a moment.
Shannon, I'll read those off to you. It'll make your life easier.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks, Kelly.
You're the wise person. I get to ask all the questions. It feels good. I'm so glad to hear that the job description, which I believe, in my opinion, has been extraordinarily narrow of what it takes to be a successful board member, is starting to expand. Because I've long said it's a demand problem. This is not a supply problem.
Exactly.
To that end, and I was as somebody who focuses on diversity and inclusion and sustainability, I'm going to use my my powers of putting this question first.
Okay.
But the skills needed, what about sustainability? I understand that boards are recommended to have a sustainability champion. What's the sort of a background that the sustainability champion might have?
Yeah, I mean, ESG is an enormous kind of emerging trend for boards. And I think there is unlikely to be a board out there that isn't thinking about this. And so, we see all kinds of backgrounds, actually. I mean, corporate sort of sustainability, those in the corporate world that have been focused on sustainability, but actually this is an area where boards are pulling from beyond a corporate background, right? So typically you'll find, as I mentioned, this sort of stereotypical CEO, CFO profile. With ESG, I think, there's so many different areas that we can pull from, right? Law, nonprofits, government, right? Academia. So I think there's some really interesting opportunities for those candidates, particularly in the ESG space.
What do you think of, in concert with that, folks who are diversity and inclusion experts, or what we call equity fluent leaders? Do you see that to be not only just being diverse, but understanding how you create and maintain diverse companies?
Yeah, I mean, I think the specific focus on diversity and inclusion would typically depend on the company and what, if we think about the board as a board trying to build a team, build a board that is representative of the skill sets that are needed to address a company's most important strategic issues. I think in the companies where diversity and inclusion is going to be a top issue, I think you're likely to see a search there for somebody with that specific background. But more broadly, as I mentioned, the chief people officer, chief talent officer kind of background is really appealing to boards because it's slightly less specific than diversity and inclusion, but actually encompasses that many times. And can allow that board director to be kind of nimble across a lot of different people-related issues that are important to the strategy of the company.
That's such great news to think we might need people expertise on a company board.
May I just add that one thing, so the board list actually recently did a survey related to COVID-19, and we asked the question, how many boards see, I forgot how it was phrased, but we asked, for your company, is providing kind of emotional support and guidance and support really for the CEO a primary role of the board? Mm-hmm. And I was surprised to see that well over half of the respondents to that question responded that wasn't a particular area of focus for the board. And it occurred to me that I think the idea of diversity in the boardroom brings a whole different, there is no question in my mind that it allows a company to be able to, one, navigate crises better. I think we're seeing that now because it brings in just a different skill set, whether it's women, people of color, or even just diverse functional backgrounds, diverse industry exposure, right? Diversity much more broadly than gender. Is a skill set that is almost required in every board director, or is a sort of a piece of success for almost every board director. And we're getting more and more acknowledgement about that across boards.
That's great. To the point, I forgot to mention one of the first questions was, can we share your slides with all the participants? So hopefully that'll be okay. And if there's anything that we can share, we'll talk afterwards. But just know attendees, we'll get you as much as we can and share even from that survey would be fantastic. So let me keep going. Is being on a nonprofit board the only entrance into a public board? Is it the best preparation? What does that look like? Nonprofit versus for-profit board membership?
Yeah, that's a great question that I definitely hear a lot, because it's very common for people to start earlier on a nonprofit than, you know, joining a for-profit board. In general, I would say if you are interested in joining a nonprofit board, you absolutely should. There is so much work that needs to be done, and it's very important and can be very rewarding. If you're thinking about it as a stepping stone to a for-profit board service, I would say it is and it isn't. So let me clarify. It isn't in the sense that oftentimes for-profit boards don't necessarily look at nonprofit and say, ah, this is a great, very transferable sort of governance type experience that would apply directly to our company. It's not necessarily a stepping stone. That said, there are a number of nonprofits that are extremely well run and in fact do have great governance. And so if you can find a board like that, you kind of get the benefit of both worlds. You're able to contribute in a way that's meaningful to you, and you're learning about governance, which is terrific. The other great reason that's kind of a side benefit of doing something that you're really passionate about is that very often many for-profit board directors are serving on nonprofit boards as well. So it's a way to extend your network in the space of boards that allows you to meet people that can be helpful in extending you know, your reach and sort of network in governance. So it's absolutely something I would recommend. I would not think of it though as a I must do this, then this, then this, or that it gives you sort of a pass into a for-profit role.
Great, and wanting to speak to both the supply as well as those who are controlling the demand curve. Here's a demand. How do you maintain the boundary between strategic advice to management, a board responsibility, and setting the strategy, which is not a board responsibility?
Yeah, this is kind of the heart of the question. I think a lot of people struggle with this because we do get quite conditioned, right, to drive. And if we're effective in our day job, we are drivers and we are setting that strategy and we are executing against it. The recommendation I would have there is, especially for a first-time director, to really rely and sort of rely on the rest of the board, both for onboarding and asking all your questions and making sure that you're clear on why things are done a certain way and what the expectations are of you on that board. Really important to be clear on that. And then also, you know, sometimes boards will set up kind of onboarding buddies, so to speak. I don't know if that's exactly the term, but, you know, to have a partner really to be able to ask your questions and model and kind of emulate a little bit the way that other board directors are doing it. There's no way we can know how to do these things, you know, naturally. I think a lot of it comes from observation. A board director once said to me that a great way to think about it is noses in, hands out. That's what she said. I thought it was a great way to describe it. You really want to know what's going on with the company. So nose in a lot of different areas and making sure you're understanding and you truly are kind of providing that oversight, but hands out. You're not actually sort of moving the pieces to make things happen. It's a good way to think about it, maybe. Oh, I think you got muted.
My dog was barking how many times? It's been over 2 months. You think I'd figure this out. Just because I don't want to lose any attendees, anybody can sign up for the board list. It is simply that we are offering Haas alums the opportunity for us to cover the costs, and we will be the recommender. So anybody on this call can sign up for the board list. I just didn't want to lose anybody because that's coming up. You're all eligible. Let's go to women are not afraid to talk about money, so I'm going to do this one. How are private company board members compensated, and what's the average board term? And I know term is a really critical challenge right now, term limits.
Yeah. So two things on compensation, without maybe getting into specific numbers, because on the private side it can range quite a bit. But typically with a private company, so I guess I'll start with nonprofit. Nonprofit oftentimes actually has reverse compensation, if you will. Sometimes a requirement to actually make a contribution, financial contribution to the board, or participate in fundraising. So that's kind of one end of the spectrum. Private companies often are compensating in equity. That can change as the company develops. Certainly for an earlier stage company, it's very likely to be only equity compensation. But as the company evolves, there are certainly packages that would include a cash compensation as well. And then with public companies, it's much more, it's regulated by the SEC and things are very, very clear. And there's a lot of focus right now on compensation. And those are, have a much more significant cash component to it. But, I think expectation of equity, I always hesitate to put just like numbers out there because I worry somebody's going to go into a negotiation and say, this is what people get compensated with. But I think, it's very helpful as you go through these conversations to have a network, again, to ask these questions. We're certainly happy to help on specific opportunities, but also I think asking and sort of getting a range for what do you think the compensation would be. It's similar to the way you might do it for an operating role. But in general, I would expect a larger portion of equity for private companies compensation.
Talk about it. Ask questions, because there is data that suggests that women aren't comfortable talking about money and equity and all that. So yeah. Your message is strong. Talk about it.
Exactly.
Get advice. Can you talk about the liability risks of serving on a board?
A little, but I will defer this one to lawyers. So my advice will actually be, I certainly am not an expert on this, but I would say if you are, in general, as you're interviewing, I think particularly for first-time directors, there is an excitement and an enthusiasm about joining a board, and when you get interest about it, to maybe be a little bit too ready to jump in without doing, you should be enthusiastic and you should be open, but certainly do your due diligence as well. I think this is a bit of a preface to my answer. It's really important to understand obviously the company, its prospects, these kinds of things, the financials of the company, but also pending litigation, any issues that the board is specifically mired in that could have liability risk. You'll want to be really clear on what those things are and absolutely have a conversation with general counsel before joining the board. And typically in that conversation, you are likely to discuss something called D&O insurance, which is insurance for directors and officers at a company. It'll be important for you to understand that policy, and that's typically provided through the company and not something that a director needs to go out and get personally. But obviously there are always exceptions to these things, so certainly explore that with the company that you're talking with. And I guess I'll probably leave it at that because I think, again, better addressed by lawyers.
As are most things.
Yes.
Liability, right? Always talk to the lawyers. We talked a lot about, or you spoke and we read a lot about, women are more likely to be put on a nonprofit board first. Mm-hmm. Are there specific things, if we are on nonprofit boards, tasks that we should take on, skills or contributions to that nonprofit board that will translate well into then being recommended onto a for-profit company board?
Yeah, I would say even beyond nonprofit, in general, one of the most sought after skill sets is somebody who is able to and willing to serve on an audit committee. So even if the finances of a business are not your favorite area, if you have some expertise to offer there and can get some experience at a nonprofit or anything that is related to being able to provide kind of an audit function, is a really attractive skill set for a board. And most any board, private up to public company. So that would definitely be an area that I would recommend. And in general, I would say any kind of committee experience is really valuable, right? So a nom-gov committee that's thinking about recruitment and sort of governance and processes for a board would be excellent to get exposure to. So if the nonprofit has a group that is focused on that, a committee that's focused on that, that would be a great area. Compensation is another one, and risk. Compensation and risk may be less sort of correlated with the nonprofit space, but those are areas, on top of your functional expertise, they're quite valuable typically for boards.
Thanks. When we first met on this partnership, I was astounded to find out how important not only is our bio, but the photo that is, accompanies our bio. And I have a question here on, if you are a newer candidate, how do you make yourself stand out? Can you talk a little bit about the bio, the photo, and how to stand out?
So these are minor things that, first and foremost, as we've talked about, it's the most important thing that you can do is be great at your job and be, an expert in your area of expertise. But there are some things that you should probably do as kind of hygiene as you start to get into the board search process. One is, it's a great idea to get professional headshots. Sometimes we'll get photos that come across that are, somebody on their sailboat or, hanging out with their dog, and those are all fine, and we're all people, and, frankly, now everyone's getting invited into my home, and, things are getting a little bit different as we go virtual. Yeah. But I would recommend, presenting yourself as a professional candidate through a professional headshot. So recommendation number one. The other, probably more important one, is to do a little bit of an audit of yourself on social media, particularly the professional ones. So, mostly LinkedIn, but potentially your persona on Twitter as well. Those are great areas for you to portray yourself as a thought leader, as kind of an expert in your area. Again, this is not critical, but you can imagine, especially for diverse candidates that might not get a warm intro through a connection or their network to a board opportunity, the first thing the board director is going to do is Google you. And so you might as well show up as the kind of candidate that you want to be on social media. And then lastly, this point about board bios, there's always a lot of talk about board bios and some confusion about how do I write a good one. And there's certainly resources that we can provide, so I'm happy to do that. Maybe as one of the follow-ups to this call, I can provide some materials. But the board bio is a way for, it's a little bit different than maybe an executive bio or your resume, but it is a way to articulate who you are as a board candidate. So it will typically, emphasize this value proposition we've talked about, and then highlight relevant experience that you've had that sort of substantiate that value proposition. So that's a very high level description, but it's an artifact that gets used in the board search process.
Excellent. I'm going to do maybe two more questions and then we'll move to a close. And all of these questions on how do I do this, we'll cover that. We're making you stay until the end, so we will tell you that. Here's an interesting question. You talked about that you support global boards. This is one of the participants who moved from the Bay Area to Sydney, lucky, 6 years ago. Looking to gain first-time board experience, is he or she limited to Australian corporation boards, or are American and for and nonprofit boards still open? Absolutely, yeah. There is quite a bit of exchange cross borders. You can imagine a scenario where an American company is really interested in entering the Australian market and is looking for somebody with expertise, in maybe that industry and understands Australia. That might be a key part of the strategy for the business, and that you might be a perfect fit for that. So that happens a lot, obviously, as we get more and more global in the way that we do business. There's more and more demand across borders for talent that sits in different markets. And vice versa, frankly, a lot of companies want to tap into specifically Silicon Valley talent to bring that into their boardrooms around the world. So there's a fair amount of that. I should say, we are officially in North America and Canada and the US. Organically, a number of candidates have joined from all around the world, and companies have come to the board list to search for candidates. But we are not officially in Australia, for example. But there's no barrier to not being there. So I'll ask a last question around committees. Is really focusing when you're being interviewed or networking on the fact that I want to serve on a specific committee, or I have a skill set, honing on a specific committee, is that an important step? It can be. I don't think it's necessary, right? I think the most important thing is getting clear what you bring to the table, and that may or may not be relevant for a committee. But sometimes, it comes up in interviews or conversations, are you willing to serve on a committee? Because, by the way, there's kind of an increased amount of time required because you have committee commitments on top of kind of being a part of the board. So generally, boards might explore whether or not you're open to that. If you're enthusiastic about it, and if you have a skill set to offer, certainly, mention that and talk about it in the interview. But it's not a requirement. Excellent. Let's move us to a close because there are a lot of, I think a lot of people, I like this. Somebody wrote in the chat, just so you know, it's NIFO, nose in, fingers out. So I want to challenge all of us today to try to use that in 5 times in a conversation. But there are a lot of questions. So I want to make sure we spend some time around how to do this, how to get in. So I'm going to do my thank yous, but I want to just say this and then Shannon repeat it so everybody understands. You're going to go to theboardlist.com/home, click Get Started to create your account. During that account creation process, if you are Haas affiliated, and that's faculty and alums, you'll be asked who can recommend you. Once you start typing in Berkeley Haas, it'll come up and you select it from the drop-down menu. Anything else that folks should know before I move into thank yous? Maybe I'll ask you 2 questions. Anything else that folks should know? Because I'm hoping that everybody's going to end and immediately go to theboardlist.com and get themselves either, if they are a company looking for board members, and hopefully you'll send this to lots and lots of people who are looking for board members. Is there anything else that folks should be thinking about or doing right when they end up this call? Get online, and then what are 2 other tactical things that people—
Yeah, I would say get online, create a profile. I think the best thing that you can do is before you, aside from joining the board list, which you absolutely should, is before you really kind of get out there and start networking this for yourself, get kind of crisp on what your pitch is for yourself. I think people that are able, I've had a lot of conversations now with candidates, and there's a really big difference between talking to somebody that's got that really clear in their head, here's what I offer and here's what I want, then those that are kind of like, I'm thinking about board service, what do you think would be a good match? I mean, that's fine, of course, in an exploratory conversation, but I think the best thing you can do is get really clear on your story. And then the second tip is go out and tell people. Make sure you tell people that it's what you want. Whether it's, you know, an executive search firm that calls you for an operating role, tell them that you're interested in board. Whether it's, you know, your network, whoever you're coming across that's relevant for this, I think getting that word out is really important. That's what I'd suggest.
Okay, great. And all of these questions, somebody said they just went and filled out a profile through the LinkedIn integration and it didn't ask the recommendation question?
It will, and if you have any trouble, I think I can see who that is. I can follow up, but as you go through the onboarding process, it will ask you.
Okay, so we'll follow up to the extent absolutely as possible with the chats and through our follow-up. But I first want to thank Shannon for being here, for the partnership. Thanks to Team Egal and specifically Jennifer Wells, who really put this all together, along with Team Tenny, or Haas Alumni Relations, Tenny Frost, who is the great leader there. It's just been great. We're so proud to offer this service for Haas alums, executive MBA students, and Haas faculty. And I want to thank all of you for showing up today. Some last words on Egal, because I'm so proud of a current project that Team Egal is working on. We're putting together, you know, so much is upsetting in the world right now, not the least of which how horrifically, disproportionately, negatively communities from diverse backgrounds are being impacted by COVID-19. So we're hard at work at putting together an equitable recovery playbook right now, we cannot return to normal. We have zero interest in returning to normal because normal was not working. So if you're interested in Egal, more events, our playbooks, we have a weekly COVID blast that we send out. Please do go on to haas.berkeley.edu/equity. We hope all of you stay safe and healthy, get onto the board list, look for diverse board members, become board members, talk about money, talk about comp, talk about equity, and really just let's diversify this place. Thank you so much. And
thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.